46 German women were led into an American mess hall in March of 1945. The guards expected panic. They expected shouting. They expected at least one of the prisoners to refuse. But they did not expect silence, because on every metal tray sat a bowl of chicken and dumplings, 2 buttered biscuits, canned peaches, and a mug of coffee so dark and warm it smelled impossible. Not acorn coffee, not burnt grain, real coffee. And for almost a full minute, not one of the women touched it. Lotte Weiss stood at the end of the table with her hands still wrapped around her tray. She was 24 years old. She had been a naval signal auxiliary in occupied France, taking coded radio traffic in a cellar near the Saint-Nazaire pocket, while the German lines broke apart around her. By the time the Americans captured her unit, her belt had been pulled 3 holes tighter than it had been the year before. Her cheeks had hollowed. Her hands shook when she climbed stairs. For months, hunger had stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like weather. It was just there, always there, a hard little moon in the stomach that never set. Their last German ration before capture had been a heel of black bread and a spoonful of turnip mash. Their first American meal was enough food to make the room look like a trick. That was why nobody ate. Because starving people learn to distrust abundance. Because every woman in that room had been told what the Americans would do to them. Propaganda had given the enemy horns. Rumor had given him teeth. And now the enemy had given them biscuits. Staff Sergeant Elias Becerra watched from behind the serving line. He was 31, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and built like a man who had lifted flour sacks before he ever lifted a rifle. Before the war, his mother had run a lunch counter in Santa Fe, where railroad men came for stew, beans, coffee, and tortillas, wrapped in cloth to stay warm. The army had discovered he could feed 200 men without burning the potatoes, and that made him more valuable in a kitchen than on a firing line. He had seen hungry men before. He had seen soldiers eat too fast and get sick. He had seen refugees stare at bread like it was evidence, so he did not shout. He did not laugh. He just stepped from behind the counter, took one clean spoon, dipped it into a bowl, and tasted the dumplings himself. Then he nodded once, as if to say, "It is only food." Across the room, an older prisoner named Ilse. Kramer lifted her spoon first. The other women watched her as if she were approaching a wire. She took one bite, her eyes shut. The spoon trembled in her hand. Then she began to cry without making a sound. That was all it took. Forks scraped. Spoons moved. Women who had learned to chew slowly, because there was never enough, suddenly had too much in front of them. Lotte took a biscuit in both hands and broke it open. Steam rose from the middle. Butter melted into the crumb. The smell hit her with such force that she almost dropped it. Because her father had been a baker in Lübeck before the war, and the smell of warm bread did not remind her of politics. It reminded her of morning. It reminded her of a flour-dusted apron. It reminded her of being a child allowed to lick plum jam from a wooden spoon. She bit into the biscuit. Then she lowered her head over the tray so no one would see her face collapse. The strange cruelty of hunger is that the body cannot accept mercy as quickly as the mind wants it. Halfway through the bowl, Lotte had to stop. Her stomach cramped. Other women stopped too, ashamed to leave food behind when every instinct screamed to protect it. Becerra noticed. He spoke to the interpreter, a Women's Army Corps corporal named Ruth Keller, who had grown up in a German-speaking family in Milwaukee. Ruth translated his words carefully. He says, do not force it. There will be breakfast. There will be lunch. There will be supper. Every day. Every day. The phrase moved through the room like a rumor too dangerous to believe. Lotte stared at the food still on her tray. For the first time since capture, she was not afraid of what the Americans might take from her. She was afraid of what their kindness might prove. The camp was called Ashford Annex, a converted training compound in the pine woods of New Hampshire. It had barracks, a small infirmary, a fenced exercise yard, a chapel that doubled as a classroom, and a mess hall that became the center of the prisoners' world. Captain Robert Hale, the officer in charge, explained the rules through Ruth Keller on the first morning. The women were prisoners of war. They would be counted. They would work. They would not leave the fence, but they would be housed, fed, given medical attention, and treated under the rules of the Geneva Convention. His voice was not warm, exactly. It was tired, it was disciplined, but there was no pleasure in it. That alone unsettled Lotte. She had expected hatred to have a sound. Instead, Captain Hale sounded like a man reading a duty he intended to obey. The first week became a series of impossible proofs. Breakfast arrived with oatmeal, eggs, toast, and coffee that was not pretending to be something else. Lunch brought bean soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, sandwiches with actual slices of ham, and apples wrapped in paper. Supper changed every evening: meatloaf, potatoes, cornbread, rice, pudding. On the fourth day, Becerra made chicken again, this time with gravy, and several women whispered that the Americans must be trying to fatten them before punishment. But no punishment came. Only the bell, only trays, only the steady humiliation of being cared for by the people they had been trained to fear. It was not the food alone that broke the story Germany had given them. It was the ordinary manners around the food. Private Billy Harrow, a 19-year-old guard from Ohio, held the mess hall door open every evening and said, "Ma'am," to women whose uniforms still carried enemy insignia. Ruth Keller corrected his German pronunciation and then corrected the prisoner's English pronunciation with the same patient smile. Captain Hale walked through the barracks himself after a freezing night to make sure the stove had not gone out. No one made speeches about goodness. No one called it mercy. That made it harder to dismiss, because cruelty usually announces itself. Decency often just keeps showing up on time. On the 8th day, a young prisoner named Marta Seidel approached the serving line with a scrap of paper folded twice in her hand. She was barely 20, with a cough that had not left her since the ship crossing. She pushed the paper toward Becerra and stared at the floor. On it, in careful English, she had written, "Thank you, the soup is warm." Becerra read it. Then he put one hand over his heart and answered in Spanish, "De nada." Ruth translated. Marta frowned, then laughed. It was the first real laugh Lotte had heard from any German woman since Belgium. After that, the mess hall changed. Words began to pass back and forth with the bread. Becerra taught them biscuit, ladle, coffee, peach, pepper. The prisoners taught him Brot Löffel, hunger, danke. Billy Harrow brought a school notebook and wrote down every German word incorrectly, which made Anna Feld, a former secretary from Bremen, correct him so sternly that even the guards laughed. The laughter was careful at first, then less careful. By the third week, Lotte had work in the chapel classroom, sorting books and newspapers under Ruth Keller's supervision. Ilse worked in laundry. Marta helped in the infirmary rolling bandages. 2 women with office training typed supply cards. The assignments were not gentle enough to feel fake and not harsh enough to feel like revenge. They were simply work. That was another surprise. The Americans seemed to believe a defeated enemy could still be useful without being broken first. At night, the women wrote letters through the Red Cross. Lottie's first letter to Lübeck took 3 hours. She wrote to her father and crossed out half the page. How could she tell a baker that his daughter had tasted better bread in captivity than she had tasted under her own flag? How could she tell her mother that the enemy warmed the barracks while German officers had let auxiliary women freeze beside dead radios? She finally wrote the only sentence that felt honest. The Americans are not what we were told, and I do not yet know what that means. She folded the page. Her hand would not stop shaking. The kitchen began because Becerra hated waste. One afternoon, he noticed 3 German women standing near the service window longer than necessary, watching him roll dough for biscuits. Their eyes followed his hands, not the food, so he asked Ruth to translate a question. Did any of you cook before the war? Lotte almost answered no, out of habit. Then she remembered the bakery, the real bakery. Not the ration line, not the war kitchen, her father's ovens, her hands in rye flour, her small pride when she could score the top of a loaf without tearing it. I baked, she said. Becerra leaned forward. Bread? Yes. His face opened. Then you are needed. Needed, not watched, not tolerated. Needed. Captain Hale allowed 4 women to help in the kitchen under supervision. Every knife was counted. Every pantry door stayed locked. The rules remained rules. But inside those rules, something human began to move. Lotte, Marta, Ilse, and Anna entered the kitchen the next morning, like women entering a church where they were not sure they were allowed to pray. Becerra gave each of them an apron. Then he pointed to sacks of flour, yeast, salt, and caraway seed he had traded for from the main depot. Show me, he said. At first, Lotte could not remember the order. That frightened her more than she expected. War had taken many things from her. Had it taken this too? Then her hands began before her mind did. Warm water, yeast, rye and white flour mixed because there was not enough of the right kind, salt, caraway crushed between fingers, a slow fold, a turn, a press with the heel of the palm. The kitchen went quiet around her. Even Becerra stopped moving. Lotte worked until the dough became smooth and heavy. When the first loaves came out of the oven, they were not perfect. The crust split wrong. The crumb was lighter than her father's would have allowed. But the smell hit the room like a door opening. Marta began to cry. Ilse turned away. Becerra did not ask why. He simply took the first loaf, cut it thick, spread butter across the steaming face, and handed the first slice back to Lotte. No cook eats last in my kitchen, he said. Ruth translated. Lotte could not speak. That supper, the German rye sat beside American stew. The soldiers noticed immediately. Men who had eaten white bread all their lives came back asking for the dark loaf. One corporal from Pennsylvania said his grandmother used to bake something like it before she died. Another said it tasted too strong, then took a second slice anyway. By the end of the week, Becerra had asked for 3 more recipes. Potato cakes fried crisp at the edges, cabbage rolls stretched with rice, a poppy seed cake that required patience and made Anna whisper her mother's name while grinding the filling. But the teaching moved both directions. Becerra showed them red chile stew from New Mexico, the kind his mother served when snow came down over the rail yard. He showed them how to make cornbread in cast iron, how to stretch pinto beans with onion and fat back, how to judge coffee by smell before it boiled bitter. The women wrote everything down in notebooks Ruth found in a supply closet. German recipes crossed with Spanish words. American measurements beside old family instincts. Cup, pinch, handful, until glossy, until it smells right. The notebooks became more than recipes. They were proof that the women still possessed something the war had not confiscated: skill, memory, taste, the ability to give, not only receive, and that changed the shape of captivity. A prison camp is designed around fences. Ashford Annex slowly began to organize itself around tables. By late April, the evening meal had become the hour everyone waited for. The women still slept behind wire. The guards still carried rifles. Counts were still taken. But after supper, the rules allowed a little space. Cards appeared. Songs appeared. Billy Harrow taught the prisoners Red River Valley badly. The German women answered with folk songs from a childhood Germany that felt older than the regime and cleaner than the flags. Sometimes Captain Hale stood at the back of the mess hall and listened without entering. He did not know what would happen to these women when the war ended. No one did. Then May 8th came. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across the main post, American soldiers cheered, wept, slapped one another on the back, and talked about going home. Inside the women's barracks, no one cheered. Some knelt by their bunks. Some stared at the floor. Marta asked if Hamburg still existed. Ilse asked whether defeat made them safer or more guilty. Lotte thought of Lübeck and saw only smoke. That evening, Becerra asked Captain Hale for permission to cook one meal with no victory speeches. Not a celebration over them, he said. A meal for the end of shooting. Hale approved it, so the kitchen worked all day. Becerra made red chile, roast chicken, beans, and coffee. Lotte made rye. Anna made potato cakes. Marta made apple dumplings from canned fruit because there were no fresh apples. Ilse made cabbage rolls and corrected everybody who touched them too roughly. At supper, the tables were pushed together. Not German tables, not American tables, just tables. No one knew whether to speak. Finally, Captain Hale raised his cup. To the end of the war in Europe, Ruth translated. He paused, then added, and to the work of becoming better than it made us. No one applauded. It would have been too easy. Instead, they ate. Some cried openly. Some smiled as if they felt guilty for smiling. Lotte watched Becerra serve the cabbage rolls with the same care he gave his own family dishes. And for the first time, she understood what had been happening in that kitchen. They were not being forgiven. Not exactly. No meal could erase the war. No loaf could clean a flag. But they were being offered a chance to become human in the eyes of people who had every reason not to bother. 3 days later, the hardest announcement came. Captain Hale gathered all 46 women in the mess hall. He told them repatriation would begin once transport was arranged. They would be sent back to Germany in groups. But there was another possibility for a small number of them. Local churches, hospitals, farms, and employers had asked whether women with clean conduct records could remain temporarily as civilian workers once their prisoner status ended. It would require screening, guarantors, hearings, security checks. It might fail. It might take months. It was not a promise of citizenship. It was not even a promise of safety. But it was a door. The room erupted. Some women rejected the idea before Ruth finished translating. Their families were in Germany. Their husbands, parents, children, graves. Home was not a question. Others went silent in the way people go silent when a future suddenly becomes visible and terrifying. That night, no one slept. The barracks filled with whispers, prayers, accusations, apologies. How can you stay with them? How can you go back to rubble? How can you leave your mother? How can you carry Germany inside you and not drown? Lotte sat on her bunk with the application folded under her hands. She thought of her father's bakery. She thought of the first biscuit. She thought of the word needed. Then a Red Cross reply reached her on May 19th. Her parents were alive. The bakery was not. A fire after an air raid had taken the ovens, the counter, the apartment above it, and every photograph that had not already been hidden elsewhere. Her father had written only 3 lines. "We are alive. Your mother is thin but walking. If your hands still remember bread, then something of home survived." Lotte read the letter again and again until the paper softened at the folds. That was her darkest hour at Ashford. Not capture, not the fence, not the night she feared American cruelty. It was the moment she understood that going home would not return her to the life she had lost, and staying would not release her from the duty to remember it. In the end, 20 women requested the papers. 26 chose repatriation. No one called the other side cowardly after the first cruel night of arguments. By morning, the women were too tired for judgment. Each choice was a wound. On June 6, the first truck arrived before sunrise. The women who were leaving carried canvas bags, letters, notebooks, and the kind of courage that does not look dramatic because it has no audience in mind. Ilse was among them. She embraced Lotte so hard the buttons on their coats caught together. "Bake it properly someday," Ilse whispered. "The bread, all of it." Then she climbed into the truck. The guards stood straighter than regulation required. Billy Harrow removed his cap. Becerra came from the kitchen with a crate of wrapped food for the road. Biscuits, hard-boiled eggs, slices of rye, apples from storage. The women took the packages with shaking hands. The truck pulled away through the gate. For a few seconds, the remaining women could still see faces between the slats. Then the road bent through the pines, and they were gone. The 20 who stayed moved into a different barracks near the administration building. Their legal status sat in a gray place between prisoner and immigrant, enemy and worker, past and future. They were paid small wages. They reported weekly. They signed forms they barely understood. Some guarantors withdrew. Some towns refused them. One woman changed her mind after 2 months and returned to Germany. Another was rejected for a political association she had tried to minimize. The door was real. It was also narrow. Lotte stayed because Becerra's mother, Rosa, agreed to stand as her guarantor through a church contact in Philadelphia. The Becerra family planned to open a small supper room near the rail yards after the war, and Elias wrote that a woman who knew bread could build half the business before the first pot of stew boiled. In November of 1945, Lotte left Ashford Annex with 2 dresses, 1 notebook of recipes, her father's letter, and $47 in saved wages. Philadelphia frightened her. The train smoke, the crowds, the language arriving too quickly from every direction. But Rosa Becerra met her at the station as if Lotte were a niece returning from school. She was short, stern, and wore a black coat with a rosary wrapped around one wrist. She looked Lotte up and down, saw how thin she still was, and said, "First we feed you, then we talk." It was the most American sentence Lotte had ever heard. The supper room opened in 1946 with 8 tables, a stove that ran hot on one side, and a hand-painted sign that said Becerra's Kitchen. At first, Lotte worked in the back. She baked rye before dawn and washed dishes until her wrists ached. Customers came for chile, beans, chicken stew, and strong coffee. Then they began coming for the bread. Railroad men bought loaves wrapped in paper. German immigrants from old neighborhoods heard rumors and came to test whether the young woman really knew how to bake. Some approved. Some complained it was not exactly right. Lotte learned to accept both as compliments. By 1949, the sign changed. Becerra and Weiss Kitchen. By 1953, there were 16 tables and a second oven. By 1961, Lotte was an American citizen, part owner, and the person customers asked for when they wanted wedding cakes, funeral bread, holiday dumplings, or a bowl of stew that tasted like being allowed to sit down. She never pretended America had been simple. There were people who heard her accent and called her Nazi. There were customers who refused food from her hands. There were nights when she dreamed in sirens and woke gripping the edge of the mattress. There were letters from Germany that arrived, full of grief, silence, and names of people she would never see again. But the table kept teaching her. A table does not erase what happened before it. It does not excuse. It does not absolve. It only asks one question over and over. Will you make room? 25 years after the first meal at Ashford Annex, the old mess hall bell hung above the door of Becerra and Weiss Kitchen. Elias had found it in a surplus lot and bought it for Lotte without telling her. On the anniversary evening, he rang it once. Not loud, just enough. Captain Hale came from Vermont, older, slower, his uniform long retired. Ruth Keller arrived with silver hair and the same precise German pronunciation. Billy Harrow came from Ohio, with his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter who asked why everyone cried when bread came out of the oven. Marta came from Connecticut, where she had become a nurse. Anna came from Baltimore with 3 children who spoke no German, but knew every word for dumpling. 7 of the women who had stayed sat together. Letters from those who had returned to Germany lay in a basket on the front table. One was from Ilse, who had found her brother alive, married late, and spent years helping displaced families trace relatives across borders. For supper, they served the old meal. Not exactly. Nothing ever returns exactly. Chicken and dumplings, biscuits, peaches, coffee, and rye bread cut thick enough to hold butter without apology. Captain Hale lifted his glass. I thought I was running a prison camp, he said. Then his voice thinned. But somewhere in those months, I learned a camp can follow the law and still forget the person. Sergeant Becerra did not let us forget. Elias shook his head. I cooked, he said. That is all. Lotte stood then. She was 49 years old. Her English was fluent now, though Lübeck still lived inside certain vowels. She looked at the faces around the room. Former guards, former prisoners, children of both. People who had met through wire and somehow ended up passing bread across a restaurant table in Philadelphia. She held up her glass. The first night we thought the food was a trap, she said. We were wrong. It was a question. She looked at Elias, at Ruth, at the old captain, at the bell. It asked whether enemies could be fed without first proving they deserved it. No one moved. It asked whether a person could be more than the worst flag she had served under. Her voice broke, but she did not sit down. And it asked what we would do if we survived long enough to set our own tables. She reached for the loaf in front of her, tore it open with both hands, and passed the first half to Marta. Then Marta passed it on. The bread moved around the room the way trust had moved all those years ago, not all at once, hand to hand, piece by piece. They had come to America behind wire. They stayed because someone made a table wider than the war.